Okay, hi everyone. So this is finally day 16, which is the last chapter of the textbook. So even though we have some additional days as one day off on Wednesday and the review of the old chapters for the exam, anyway, this is the end of all the chapters of the textbook, and all the exam questions will be taken from chapter 1 through chapter 16. So this is a chapter of the last chapter of the exam questions in August 17th in this Friday. So we will cover what are the issues about the war and terrorism related with the US. So I will limit on the topics and the issues of the war and terrorism in the US usually. So I will see what are the sociological explanations of the theories regarding the war and the terrorism, and what are the social factors influencing the war and the terrorism, and what are the impacts of the war and terrorism, and usually what are the positive and negative aspects of the war on terrorism or the military power or military budget of the US. So there were war and terrorism in the whole history and all of the societies. So some people said that war and terrorism, usually the war is the necessary evil for noble regions. However, how much noble for the everyone? So is it noble for everyone, or noble for some specific people or specific country? It's very debatable that the meaning of the noble is universal or too limited to some specific people. So there are some high costs and expenditure on the industry in the military industry complex. So there was concern about the militarism because it's emphasizing a lot of the military policy and military spending. And also there are some terrorism all over the world. So I cannot say all countries suffer from the terrorism, but many parts of the whole the world suffer from the terrorism. So what are the causes or dynamics on the result of the war and terrorism? So we will see the possible actions for the reducing the threats of the war and the terror in the US or to the US. So functionalism is some kind of some positive view, but also the negative view. But I will majorly explain about their positive views toward the war and terrorism. So they think that, or they try to seek the what are the benefits? I mean, what are the positive or usefulness of the war and terrorism for the society? And also there are some how horrible they are in many other aspects, but some famous sociologists in the early 19th century, Robert Park, said some of four types of the usefulness of the war. He said war resolved international disputes, generating the strong bond and solidarity within the society. So it is also called that external conflict makes the internal cohesion. So if we imagine, or if we just remind some social solidarity after the terror or the 9/11, so we call it 9/11 or not 9/11, 9/11. So after that terrorism, even though it is not a war, but after that kind of the big threat to the world or to the country, the people or the citizens are more likely to have some higher solidarity and the bond because they think they are all together in the one fate and one society and one group of the society. So it also makes some like a high bond in the society, usually the victim of society, and also leading the society to have the rapid development of the nation state and maintaining freedom and democracy and increasing job openings of the people of color and women, because they are all spending their own resources to the war. So especially for the more disadvantaged people, such as people of color or women, they also needed to be participating in the workplaces or the workplaces. So that's why they have some like increased job chances of the or the other chances. We cannot say these are the only good for them, but anyway, there are some benefits. So also work contribute the development of science and technologies like that. So medical sciences or the world system, they require the very essential development in the science for the better bombs or for the better weapons, especially for the like a better hygiene system or better medical system to cure the wounded soldiers. So it also provides some grounds of the development for the technologies of the society. However, how are the negative consequences of them? In functionalism, it doesn't have some strong power of explanation of the negative consequences of the war and terrorism. Conflict theory also criticized the influence of the military-industrial complex. So they think that circulation of the elite, especially for the elites of the government and the big business, I mean the corporations and the military power. So they circulated their seats, I mean their positions. So the power elites from the government go to the CEO of the big business such as the military corporation, and like a 4-star or 5-star military general go to the government and then go to the big corporation and then come to the military again. So the ruling classes are circulating their positions within that group. So and then take the important roles and control the society or control the nation again and again. So in the United States and in the world, war is a very big business because the size of the spending is super high for maintaining the military force or exporting the high weapons like the F-16 or F-14 or the firefighters or the other fighting weapons. These are extremely expensive. So war is driven by the benefits or profits of the corporation, usually the military complex or business leaders. And also the conflict theory criticizes imperialism, using the military power of the nation to increase or to enhance the power range of the nation all over the world. So controlling over other nations by the power, they can have some benefits such as the oil supply and the extending military and economic influence of the US. So there is like an efficiency matter. So even though the US spend a super amount of money for the military power or for the war or military control power, but what if we can invest some part of the funding or the military budget for the social infrastructure or for education or environment? So there are some debates of the efficiency or the usefulness or the legitimation of the expenditures for the war or the terrorism. Symbol internationalism mainly takes about the views to the perceptions of the people toward the war and the terrorism. So the soldiers and the civilians and the others may have some different interactions or perceptions of the war and the terrorism. How people use the symbols to marshal or support the war or protest against the war and terrorism. So when we use the flags of the American flags, so that may be supporting the war or marshal the war to support the war, and otherwise maybe flags could be some protesting against the war and the terrorism with the patriotism or the confidence of the war, confidence of the nation. So the symbol of peace and the yellow ribbon are the parts of the examples of the symbols to protest the war or to support the war. And the concepts of the war and the terrorism can be defined in the ways of the goals. So the killing people or killing the opponent of troops is the main goal of the war or the soldiers participating in the war. However, if they retreat or they retire from the military and come back to country, maybe they would need to change their viewpoints and re-socialize again. So the killing actions in the battle can be perceived as the goal or even the ideal goal, like killing the opponents or other troops and surviving. So calling the civilian like their killing the actions can be justified by their perception or by their social their structural condition. And maybe just calling civilian deaths or woundings as the collateral damage instead of the massacre or the giant killing possibly minimize the public horror or civilian deaths. So there are many ways to have some impact the perceptions as more positive ways or the negative ways toward the war and the terrorism. Perception can be how we perceive the terrorism. So in some case, I mean in some part of the world, maybe the terrorism of the ISIS can be perceived as the like a freedom soldiers or freedom fighters, even though we perceive that as the like a terrorism or violences without the just without escapable or justification. So, based on the perceptions of the culture and religion of their social backgrounds, the meaning of the terrorism or the war can be differentiated each other. And war in the U.S. In the war history of the U.S., the USA participated a lot of the wars. So even it is called or it is analyzed that about 20% of the all years of the history of the U.S. participated in the war, at least some part of the world. So U.S. military force has played a really fundamental role for the better or worse. So it's not deniable that U.S. military and the U.S. military power takes a great or very important role in all over the world. But it cannot be justified in the one simple word like for the good or for the harm or not good. So there are many debates. But anyway, military both protect advance the political and the economic interest of the U.S. So it's also a possible explanation of the wars and the military power of the U.S. But charging the military has been some instrument of the imperialism, critics say. So there are also some the two or three major debating parts or the arguing parts about the war and the military power of the U.S. So explain the war, there are some scholars using the biological evolutionary theory that war or the aggression is a part of our genetic heritage to survive and development. So we have some innate aggression, and the war is the expression of the our inherent genetics. But there are many criticisms, but saying that the human's brain is far more from the instincts by the brain. So even though we have so many instincts, but we can control our instincts not to be the criminal or not to harm others. So genetic instinct cannot solely impact our human behaviors. Even though we have some instincts from the brain or other hormones, but we do not behave just solely based on that. Because we have some thoughts and knowledge and other recognitions of the ways of the socialization. So warfare can be more cultural than biological, and most people are not violent, so soldiers need to be resocialized after coming from the war, because the kind of aggression to kill the people may not be the normal status of the people. The social construction of the war. So it's seeing the roots of the decisions as the political party or the military officers. So they usually overemphasize the necessity of the defending the nation's people, so increase the concerns to some specific the risks of the war, and then the attract or the having some the good public opinions by the media and by the public, and thus decide the war declaration to the other countries. However, some decisions are based on cynicism or deceit. So war against Iraq was the clearing the mass killing the weapons, the chemical weapons, but so far it is believed that there was no the mass destruction or mass destroying weapon in there. So it was kind of some mistreat and like a deceit, overemphasized by the U.S. military or the U.S. White House. But this is not clear that we can just solely argue or solely criticize the war or just support the anti-war a lot in the U.S. So critics argue that Putin fabricated or exaggerated the level of threat to justify the war, to win the support for the war. But there are also the major regions of the war, such as population change. So if or environmental change, ideology, prejudice, and religion as also impact the risk of the war. Maybe the many wars in the Middle East or some kind of the war situation between the India or Pakistan or United States are related with the different ideology or religion or other interests. So civilians of the war, so they are some one of the major casualties. I mean the dead people or died in the war. So in many memorials or other the medias, they sometimes neglect the amount or the stories about the civilians killed in the war. Mass killing weapons can kill the troops or in the military forces, but also can kill a massive number of the civilians not directly involved in the battles in the war. So we cannot say the civilians are not connected with the war because they can support the war and they can work for the factories to produce the weapons, but it's not clear that they are involved in the battle. So possibly it cannot be legitimated to the massacre for the civilians committed by the U.S. The military happened in the Korean War or the Vietnam War in the other places. So military strategy is destroying the field. So especially in the Vietnam War, there were some assassins or other terrorists from the Vietcongs. Usually, the hide it in the very hide it in the streams or hide it in the trees out there. But the major strategy in the Vietnam War is destroying all over the places, such as the destroying the fields or destroying all the social infrastructure and destroying all the nature, so that Vietcongs cannot hide in there. But it can also destroy the humans, even the civilians, a lot. So the civilians are one of the major victims of the war, and the veterans. So not set aside from the dead troops in the war. After the war, even for the survived veterans or the troops suffer from a terrible level of the psychological and the physical defects or special medical problems or physical problems. So their wounds can remain for them for life. So they need to have some practical support to overcome those kind of the mental or physical wounds. Even they have some higher unemployment rate. So general public has 8.5 as the unemployment rate, but they have, I mean the veterans of the war returned from the war has 13.1% of the unemployment rate after retirement or retreat from the military service, and that they have the high level of the mental health problems, as we call PTSD, post-trauma symptoms of the depression in there. So higher suicide rate and the memory rules, and also as the U.S. has the deployed troops all over the world, there are many problems or mental health problems and other fears of the families of the deployed troops. And also there are higher level of victimization of the sexual assault and rape of the women veterans by the other military personnel. And also there are other impacts of the war, because impact of the war are very huge for the civilians or the veterans and all the individuals of the war of the society. So we can think about the what are the impacts and the solutions of the war. The war can change the political system and the leadership if they make some big changes, and even the changes the population distribution. So around the World War II, because many soldiers were sent to the World War II, there were so many dead or wounded soldiers that mainly resulting in the many wives or mothers die having without some breadwinners. I mean the main breadwinners. So they had some higher poverty level compared with the families with the breadwinner. I mean healthy breadwinners. So after the war, the population distribution, or I mean the population pyramid, can be changed because of the wounded or dead soldiers during the war. And there are some increasing level of the racial desegregation of the military. So this is also some kind of the positive impacts. Because of the war, they needed so many soldiers. So usually the underrepresented group, I mean the people of color or women, could join the forces of the labor force or the military forces. So it helped the racial desegregation of the military. The US military budget is also the big issue in the US because it's truly large. So as I mentioned before, the unit of the expenditure is super high. So depending on the situation or between the nation or the country, it may be varying a lot. But buying some tank or the military weapons are extremely expensive. So like buying some missile or some rockets, it can cost a super amount of money compared with the building some schools or spending for the poor like that. So military budget takes part of the high proportion of the federal spending. So we call that about 43% through 48% of the whole federal income tax dollars are spent on the military budget. So it is called that 20% of the whole federal budget or federal expenditure are spent on the military budget, but there are some like a hidden expenditure. So scholars say that all of the income, so about half of the federal income budget or federal income tax dollars are spent on the military spendings. So U.S. Arms exports a lot of the weapons. So about 35% of the all world arms exports came from coming to the U.S. military, resulting in the high expenditure on the military weapons. Military spending took money away from the important domestic needs, such as spending on the hygiene or sanitary or the health of the people and other social infrastructure. Even the war cost can be one where wars for the huge amount of needs as more than the whole needs of the California state like that. So scholars disagree that the high level of the U.S. spending is needed to ensure the nation's security. So it's also flooded by the high costs in the lobbying the Congress for the military complex and maybe the maintaining just jobs related with the military complex. So it also says that the pros-cons, the supporters of the military budget and military complex say that if we lose the military budget, maybe we lose the many job openings. However, scholars say that compared with the expenditure level, it's not producing the many jobs compared with the expenditure level, saying that it's a poor job creator. So terrorism is a big issue in these days, but before the 9/11, the 9/11, the terrorism in the New York and Manhattan World Trade Center, the terrorism was very far from the lives of the Americans. But anyway, after then, U.S. spent more money for war on terror, even more than the expenditure on the wars like Iraq War. So regarding the terrorism can be defined as something like a violence for the using the violence or for the goal of the making people afraid, for the desire for the political, social, economic, and cultural changes by the fearness. And also there are some other perspectives that one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. So it can be applied in the history of the US. So in the colonial period and in the Revolutionary War, some fighters, some terrorists on the British troops can be considered as the freedom fighter for the independency or the independence of the U.S. But for the British, it can be perceived as the terrorism because there was attacks toward them. So the use of the unexpected violence to intimidate or coerce the people in the pursuit of political and the social object by the girl is the some kind of the formal explanation or the definition of the terror. There are four types of terrors. So vigilante terrorism is the violence committed by the private citizen toward the other private citizens, such as KKK or other massive shootings in the U.S. So maybe in like 1 week ago there was some shootings in the Chicago, and maybe they can be they may not have some terrorism goals or terrorism objectives, but these kind of the terrors or the violence can be considered as a vigilant terrorism because it's the killing or the attacking or doing some violences from the private citizens toward the private citizens in the same country. The insurgent terrorism is the violence committed to the private citizens against their own government, business, or institutions, seen as representing the establishment. So, as I mentioned before, in the American Revolution War, the terrors against the British can be considered an insurgent terrorism. Transnational terrorism is one of the most severe or important or terrifying events or terrorism in the world in these days. So this is like a violence committed by the citizens of one nation against target in another nation, such as the 9/11 or the terrors done by the ISIS and the other religious groups. So the state terrorism is the violence committed by a government against its own citizens. So it's very ironic thing that because in some decades ago, the scholars said that the terrorists, I mean the individual terrorists, are low educated or have some psychological problems inserting or increasing the level or the chances of the having some terrorism or the commit some terrorists. However, in recent data, it's ironical that temporary terrorists are having some better wealth level compared with the common street criminals. So we need to focus on instead of the psychological problems, we may need to see what are the structural roots of the terrorism. Recent terrors by the radicalization and the rage in the Muslim world are on the focus on kind of centered issue of the terrorism in the world. So it's kind of perceiving other nations or religions as the enemy of their religious belief would be their roots of the terrorism. But recently, so you can say that there are some terrorism from the Muslims, but we cannot say that Muslim is all only source of the terrorism. So any conditions, so there are some controversies and like debating points. So any social conditions cannot justify terrorism, damaging the public. So it's kind of violence toward the other citizens or other nation. Possibly may not be directly involved in their threats or their hostility. However, terrorism is damaging other people without some clear objectives or without some close connections. So it may not justify the terrorism, but there is also like other sources that we need to see or we need to know what are the causes of the radicalizations or the rage of the Muslim world. The impact of terrorism. So terrorism may not have some benefits for the victims. It's very apparent that it increases the public fear, and it's kind of causing the huge expenditure for the national security network. So we have some argues that war on terror imposed huge domestic costs because it's spending even more than the war. So even we take some part of the budget for the war on terror, we can spend a lot on the social infrastructure of the U.S. So we covered many social issues or problems in the previous chapters, such as the health or health insurance, or other problems like rape or other workplace problems. So if we can spend more money on those issues, or we may have some better life quality or other things. So there are many critics or many arguments about the budget of the military or the impact of budget for the terrorism, but it's very hard to say in the world that which is the better, to secure the nation's safety or the spend on the social infrastructure. It's very debatable. Anyway, ignoring the concerns of the rest of the globe, because the war on terror concentrates on the safety issue or the destroying the possible basis of the terrorists, but it may neglecting the other concerns of the rest of the globe. Or usually the war on terror can be motivated and contribute to prejudice and the hate attacks or hate crimes against the Muslims and the Middle East ethnicities. So it's true that some types of the terrors are originated or designed from the terrorists from the Middle East or the Muslim religion. However, we cannot assume that all the Muslims and the Middle East ethnicities are all the terrorists or something. So we may need to differentiate our beliefs, or we should not have some high level of the prejudice against the Muslims and the Middle East ethnicities. preventing the war and terrorism. So for the war, we need to approach it to like armed control and diplomacy. We need to clarify the roots of the wars. So we should aware that some politicians and military corporations may use some chances of the war to maximize their benefit. Usually, the like using or selling the weapons, they can have much more benefit comparing with the without the war situation. So we need to question and we need to investigate the assumptions about the necessity of the war, militarism, and the size of the military budget. We also need to some differences. So we may need to have some higher acceptance level between some like differences and toward to the differences of the ideology, religious belief, or other orientations. And we need to manage the military budget because it's like a super high level. So there are many questions that even if it is very appropriate amount of the budget or is over emphasize the budget or not. So we need to see how to manage the military budget in more appropriate way. About the terrorism, so we need to have some efforts like efforts to capture the attempts of the known terrorists or controlling the military power of the terrorists or the terrorist camps. But also we need to recognize cultural roots as the terrorism. So there are like a violence or the physical powers to control the military or control the terrorism or the possible terrorists. However, there will be always the different social and structural roots, such as the different culture and different ideology and religion. So we need to have some better understanding or the notions of the different roots of the roots of the culture and the religion and other differences in their origins. So so the kind of hostility or other the controls may accelerate or even touches of the terrorism. So we may need to understand the roots of the different culture and different religion or different settings of the nations, possibly increase the risk of the terrors. So okay, so congratulations, this is the end of the chapter in the textbook. So please submit your quiz and daily writing. So your daily writing of the today will be the final one because tomorrow is the off day, and in the review session you don't have any more writing assignments. So you don't have the writing assignments anymore after finishing today's writing assignment. And as I mentioned before and announced it before, tomorrow, the Wednesday, is the off day. So you will use your time to prepare your exam. And also I will post my lecture slide for the introduction of the recent issues of the population changes or population issues in the US tomorrow. So the voters who voted for the maintaining the current schedule do not need to worry about that or disappointed about that. So the lecture slide will be posted, and the quiz of the review session will be like 10 questions. But anyway, tomorrow is the off day, so use your time to read my lecture slide because I will upload my lecture slide tomorrow. So all the lecture slide after revising the typos and other problems, and then you will be able to use my lecture slides as the basis of your preparation of the final exam, and then read the textbook if you have some if you need to some clarification from the lecture slide, and then prepare your exam. Actually, I also posted one announcement, or I think I posted one page about the preview of the exam. So if you have any questions about the exam, just let me know, and then I will let you know as many as possible. Okay, thank you for your time, and see you 2 days later.